hear the worst and the most sharp things that partly I agree and partly I disagree, somehow in Scottish accent it sounds so much nicer and so much better. And I could listen to you the whole evening instead of talking, because I really, really like this accent. But there were some questions which all touch the same points. So I want somehow to answer them together. And this is about anti-Semitism, about being accused in anti-Semitism, about guilt feelings of Europe, etc., etc. First of all, Israel is manipulating, not Israel, also the Jewish establishment all over the world, especially in the United States. There is this Anti-Defamation League in the United States, which is working only on fabricating anti-Semitic incidents and to show how anti-Semitic the world is. I try always to say something that I don't know how many of you care about the future of Israel as a Jewish state, but you can also be someone who cares about the future of Israel and still criticize very bitterly the state of Israel. I always give this example. If you have a relative or a friend who is a drug addict, there are two ways to handle him. One is to supply him with more money, so he will buy more drugs. He will appreciate it. He will be grateful to you, but he will continue to be a junkie. And the other way is to send him to a rehabilitation center where he's going to suffer. He's going to hate you, but this is real friendship. Same about our personal relations. Do we really appreciate those friends who never criticize us? Does friendship mean not criticizing? So I say here, like I say everywhere, being friendly to Israel today means criticizing Israel and putting pressure on Israel, and many times fighting against occupation, and still you can be considered as someone who cares about the future of Israel. More than this, nothing of this has to do with anti-Semitism. And we know that there are some elements who are using it really out of anti-Semitic motivations. But I think the big majority of the voices which are critical toward Israel had nothing to do with anti-Semitism. Has to do with universal values, has to do with many times friendship to Israel, has to do with wanting a more just and peaceful world. And Israel is a big obstacle for this. And therefore, you shouldn't, really you should ignore all the accusations as if this has to do with anti-Semitism. Just ignore it. Just ignore it. Because that's the way of Israel to carry away its responsibility. And as I said, and to make the critic voices the guilty ones. And this manipulation cannot go on. I mean, they claim that Richard Goldstone is anti-Semitic, yes? This guy who was active in Zionistic organizations, who was active in Israel, whose daughter was living for 12 years in Israel out of Zionistic motivation. This guy was declared anti-Semitic in Israel, only because he dared to criticize Israel. This cannot be, and the best way is to ignore it. Every European has today the right to criticize Israel as much as he wishes, and with all the respect, and there is a lot of respect, to the historical heritage of Europe. We are dealing now with a second, third generation, and with all the respect, this has nothing to do with the Holocaust. This is, by the way, mostly true about Germans who really don't dare to say a word. They really don't dare to say a word, most of them. And this will also change. And Israel should stop manipulating also this, because it is one thing to believe or not to believe in the right of the Jews to have a state, and another thing is to believe what the late Golda Meir said, this unforgettable sentence, that after the Holocaust the Jews have the right to do whatever they want. This is unacceptable. And I think that Europeans can criticize Israel, have the right, have the duty to criticize Israel, mainly the occupation, mainly the policy. And what does this have to do with the Holocaust? In the same time, I must be very frank with you. I think that anyone who compares what Israel is doing in the territories to the Nazi regime is counterproductive. It's just counterproductive, because it's very, very easy to prove that it's not the same. And then everything is wonderful, so what do you want? We are not the Nazis, so what do you want? So even not from the moral point of view, even from the practical point of view, this is not clever, this is counterproductive, because anyone who knows the history knows you can compare Israel with Germany of the early 30s. This is one thing. But you can't compare the Nazis to what Israel is doing. And if you do so, you miss the point, because nobody can take you seriously. Because with all the respect, there is a big difference. Maybe it's going to this direction. Maybe one day, God forbid, it will be there. But we are still far away. And why to compare when it is terrible enough? Why to exaggerate? I always say, don't exaggerate, because the reality is so terrible. No need with exaggerations. No need. And I don't accept even the term genocide. Because, or especially not if it speaks about Kastled. Kastled was horrible, was brutal, was criminal. But 1,400 people killed out of 1.5 million is not a genocide. And we better use the correct terms because of the cause that we all fight for. Not because it's not politically correct to say so. I don't care about political correctness. But we lose the battle when we exaggerate. This reality is terrible enough. Believe me, what Israel is doing is so horrible, so shameful and so criminal. No need to compare. You can compare it to the apartheid, sure. This is a fair comparison, with differences. I hosted once a group of human rights activists from South Africa in the refugee camp of Balata. Out of them, 2 were Supreme Court judges. And when we came out, I asked them what every Israeli would have asked them. No, can you compare apartheid with this? They say, no, it's much worse than apartheid. So you can take it from all kinds of angles, and still it is a fair comparison with all the differences. But to compare to the Nazis, I mean, I don't think it's right to do. I don't think it's clever to do. Now, I would just one argument to raise to you. And again, I have my problems with the ridiculous thing which is called Jewish state, which nobody knows what does it mean. It's one of those cliches in Israel, Jewish and democratic state. First of all, it's contradictory. You can't, it's either Jewish or democratic, and I prefer democratic, no doubt. But you must take into account that the Jews define themselves not only as a religion, but also as a people. And we speak about the Jewish people, so it's also a national definition. It's not just a religion. So it's not to compare it to the Muslims or the Christians, because Jewishness, you can be a secular Jew. And we can take it to a long argument, and things are not totally clear and totally defined. But to look at Jewishness as only a religion is not a fair description of it, because it's also about something which is called nationality or people, or the Jews by themselves don't know to define it very clearly. But only as a religion, this, I don't think it is a fair description.